So, I don't know about you guys, but I've been having a hard time sleeping lately. So, I thought maybe a little bit of story time would be helpful to me. Doing some. He wrote a book called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which was my introduction to him, and I'm just an absolute huge fan of that. But that's not what we're reading tonight. We're reading a novella from Radicalized. So the title of this story is The Masque of the Red Death. So full note, it's a bit topical. The core concept is like what happens when elitists in the face of some kind of apocalypse decide to fuck off to their own, super fortress. I guess, what did I say? Ayn Randian silos of excellence is the way that I like to say it. But basically use their resources to escape from the world and ride it out on their own. And I think the takeaway for this story is that we really just sort of can only solve problems together, and that trying to take yourself out of the struggle in the world around you is really not a good way for things to go. So this is a pretty angry take on that type of story. The description in the cover for the book is, so The Masque of the Red Death. Martin's a smart guy. He knows the big collapse is coming. He's spent years creating his hidden desert retreat, the one stocked with enough food, guns, and antibiotics for Martin and a bunch of his invited friends. These are the men and women, well, Martin hopes some of them will be women, who intend to ride out the coming catastrophe and emerge to pick up the pieces, because they're the smart ones. Nothing about their plan could possibly go wrong. Everything about their plan goes wrong. So I don't know how long I'm going to read for tonight. The story's maybe like 55 pages or something like that. But I figure I'll go for, 10 or 15 minutes or whatever point seems like a good stopping point. So if that sounds interesting to you, get comfortable and I'll start reading. So, Cory Doctorow, Radicalized, The Masque of the Red Death. Before the event, Martin Mars spent a lot of time trying to game it out. Would the collapse be sudden, catching him off guard and unprepared, having to fight his way to his fortress as he escaped from Paradise Valley and into the desert hills? Or would there be some kind of sign, a steady uptick in civil disorder, and failures from the official powers that counted down to the day, giving him a chance to plan an orderly withdrawal to Fort Doom? This was important. If Martin spooked and ran for Fort Doom too early, he'd have to slink back to the city and his job after however many days he'd spent bunkered up. Not only would it be humiliating, but it would cost him credibility with the 30, the people he'd invited to survive the apocalypse with him. Once Fort Doom was buttoned up for the duration, he'd need to be a credible leader, or he could lose control. Who the fuck knew what would happen next? He had visions of some distant descendant cracking the big doors and finding their mummified corpses sprawled in the postures they'd crumpled into when the ravening mob had turned in on itself. Every time he sounded the alarm and brought the 30 out, he increased the chance that one or more of them would leak the existence of Fort Doom. They were all under strict pledges of secrecy, but when shit's going down, someone's gonna leak to that cute girl they were trying to get with. And or leave a trail that some curious rando could follow. There would come a day when the 30 would have to defend what was theirs from the people who lacked the foresight to build their own fortresses. But Martin's preference was for that day to be a long way off, after they'd had a chance to cohere into the mutual survival unit they'd need to be to wait out the event. So there were so many reasons not to send up a flare and summon everyone to the fort prematurely, but what about the costs of waiting too long? Paradise Valley was all right, sure, but Phoenix was right there on their doorsteps. And there were so many people with so little to lose out there, people who were already killing and raping each other. What would they do once the cops were all too busy struggling for their own survival to defend the stolid burghers of Paradise Valley? Wait too long, and it might be Mad Max time, fighting his way through God knew how many bad guys to get out to the hills. What if they followed him? I mean, he could get the fort buttoned up even if he was fighting a rearguard action. The fort's defenses were explicitly designed for that. but any of the 30 who showed up would be torn apart by the besieging army before they could get to the fort's door. Or worse, they'd make it to the door, but it would be too dangerous to let them in. That would be a real confidence booster when it came to his leadership, watching helplessly from inside the fort while the chuds or zombies ripped a work colleague to shreds on the doorstep. It was a hard problem, and it was never far from Martin's mind as he sat at his Bloomberg terminal, watching the markets move, the currencies rise and fall, the assets bubble up and tank. Martin knew that the event was coming. The fact was, the world just didn't need all those people anymore, and the market had revealed that fact, squeezing them into tinier, more uncomfortable places. He wouldn't tolerate it if he were in their shoes. He'd be the first one to build a guillotine, and because he was Martin, it would be an awesome guillotine. So absolutely badass and over-engineered with a turbocharger and a self-sharpening blade, because that was Martin all the way. It's why Fort Doom was the incredible place it was. It was all about information asymmetries. Markets corrected them. If knowing a secret could make a stupid, unworthy person rich, then sooner or later, smart, superior people would find that secret out, clear out the misallocated wealth of all those dim bulbs. Markets were awesome at this. Back when everyone lived in shithole Mud Street villages, the superior people had no choice but to breed with whoever was in the vicinity. Even a 1 in 10 million Six Sigma genius would end up hitched for life to some cow-eyed milkmaid, diluting the incredible genes he'd been handed by nature's Powerball lotto. But little by little, humans got smarter, as the geniuses found smarter milkmaids, until they could build markets, and then the information systems that markets thrived on, and then the information asymmetry started to collapse, slowly at first, then all at once, like a cliff that had been undermined by the inexorable tide of millions of human actions, harnessed to the common goal of improving the species and its dominion over the earth. Once the information about where the best people were hanging out became public knowledge, then anyone who fluked into good genes and a high sigma knew exactly where they belonged. Little by little, the world's cities filled up with powerful, self-governing people whose discipline and hard work and brilliance meant that they got richer and richer. Give the socialists credit, they had this figured out. They knew that the world was heading to a state when the number of betas and gammas the alphas needed to keep the systems running would far exceed the demand, and that those unnecessary people would be squeezed out little by little, and then all at once. They wouldn't go out without a fight, of course. Of course, who would? It was just like gentrifying, but on a grand scale. Fuzzy-headed crybaby leftists thought that gentrifying was some kind of conspiracy to screw poor people. But it was just the market again. Location is an asset. If you happen to luck into a house that was a short drive from someplace really important, a financial center, say, or a beautiful view, and all you did with that location was build a shitty little house you couldn't afford to maintain on that plot of land, then the market would solve the problem. And it would hook you up with someone smarter and better than you with the capital to pay you more for the house than you thought it was worth. And then they do something with it that made it worth even more. Lots more. That's what markets did. They moved fallow, underutilized assets out of the hands of the incompetent and moved them into the hands of their betters. Who put those assets to work? Like a Monopoly player who couldn't figure out how to corner suited properties and build houses and hotels. The semi-employed, semi-employable dim bulbs who lucked into a prime piece of location would soon find themselves gently ushered to a place that was better matched with their worth to society. And the human race. Lather, rinse, repeat. The smartest and best had figured out how to improve even the most marginal assets, well beyond the capacity of the 99%. And now the 99% had found themselves relieved of all their worldly goods, and lacking the sums to rent anywhere to perch while they waited to die. This was an adjustment period, 2 words that sounded bloodless and bureaucratic, but which described the chaos that would reign while the unnecessariat were eased out of existence, and humanity realigned itself around the strongest and brightest that evolution could select. Martin wasn't racist. Any couple could win the genetic lottery, and that's why there were a couple of black guys and all those Indian women working at the fund with him, smart as hell, but At the same time, he couldn't help noticing just how many of the smartest people he knew had the same skin color as him. Economists called it an adjustment period, but people like Martin called it the event. Martin had wrestled with numbers and personalities before settling on the 30. First, why 30? The fort had been built with 15 bedrooms, and he'd done the math on per-person food, water, and other consumable reserves, and every person you added multiplied all those numbers, adding linear feet of shelving to hold toilet paper, and MREs, and bottled water. Each one translated into more solar panels, more batteries, more gas for the Jennies, but each one was also another strong set of hands to carry and build and fight. Half of them would be women, half of them would be men, half single, half coupled. Martin was single, and he had obviously kept that thought in mind when he picked the single women to invite. He'd made it clear to all the singles that there would be no plus ones on the day. This was an invitation for them, and them alone. If their circumstances changed, if they got into a serious thing with someone, then they could tell Martin, and he'd pick someone else to replace them. It wasn't like they were paying. One of the decisions Martin had made early on is that this would all be on his dime. It was a baller move, an alpha move, the kind of thing that would give him leadership credibility when it mattered. And there was a pretty good chance that cash would be worthless after the event. He'd built a hidden vault into Fort Doom with some gold ingots, some encrypted thumb drives with Bitcoin, some dollars, some sapphires, and a few neat packets of renminbi, which felt right. You never knew. He could afford it. He could afford all of it. Martin and the market understood each other. He was a star at the firm, personally managing a portfolio worth $11 billion in it, which he had personally grown from $9 billion. There was talk of giving him his own fund, giving the most ultra-high net worth types the chance to subscribe directly, and giving him tons of freedom to do as he saw fit with it. When he thought about this, his brain kind of split into two different mutually exclusive thought processes. The first one started adding up bonuses and commissions and new base pay. The second one wondered how much of that would arrive before the event. Maybe the event would never happen. He was a Bayesian reasoner, not a fortune teller. He gave odds, not certainty, like a good poker player. When he started planning Fort Doom, he was like 40-60, and it wasn't until he hit 50-50 that he broke ground on it, using the kind of discreet contractors that specialized in panic rooms. The firm he'd picked had a long waiting list, but when he described the size of the job he was planning, they brought in trusted subs they worked with on other big projects and started right away. Now it was done. He was more like 75-25 on the event. And of course it was possible that he was feeling that way because Fort Doom was so fucking cool. It would be awesome to hole up there and wait out the chaotic months or years until stability was restored. He called it too early. When the markets opened on January the 2nd, there was a flash crash, seemingly precipitated by wildfires in the Canadian prairies, which were supposed to be under too much ice for anything to burn at that time of year. A bone-dry autumn, a failed harvest, then an unseasonably hot winter that screwed up things in the big oil sands pipeline, touching off a spill in a wooded area that turned into a forest fire that turned into a wildfire. It had been rumbling all along through the Christmas week, a constant background beat to the news reports. Here's how fucked up things are in Saskatchewan. And now, a story about a soldier who made it home in time for Christmas. Martin moved some assets around, bought some swaps, and hedged up like a pro, even getting called in to facilitate a firm-wide meeting on the systemic risks the Canadian situation presented. But other firms weren't nearly as well managed as Martin's. Nevertheless, they had a lot of money under management, which started to vanish like fairy gold as the sell-off touched off more sell-offs, and it all began to blaze. More panic selling, more contagion, and Martin was still keeping his head cool, moving stuff around, one trade ahead of the flames, even scooping up some bargains when frightened fools sold the assets they should have been holding. Not just financial instruments either. He took possession of a shipping container full of early Picassos in a climate-controlled facility outside of Amsterdam, and even used one of his personal accounts to buy some legendary Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which he had shipped by bonded courier straight to the office. They came in their own lithium cell-powered piezoelectric coolers that kept them at optimal temperature and humidity, and he plugged them in next to his go bag. 4 bottles, each worth as much as a new Mercedes, and 1 more bottle worth as much as a decent 2-bedroom house in a nice part of Phoenix. It made him giddy to leave it there by the door instead of downstairs in his cellar with its special locking vault. Maybe it was the thought of toasting the apocalypse of Fort Doom with his investment-grade wine, but he found himself on a hair trigger, almost ready to call the event and head to the fort 6 times a day. The second Arab Spring was a lot uglier than the first. It was winter, for one thing, and the food riots were as out of control as the Canadian wildfires. Every shitty-ass dictator in the region had learned the lesson of Bashar al-Assad. When the people hit the streets, you hit the people hard. The blood was incredible. Then the bombs went off in Houston, pop, 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 targeting a police station, the Highway Patrol headquarters, and the FBI building at 1 Justice Park Drive. The president vowed revenge. Feds swarmed Houston, and Atlanta went off. Boom, boom, boom. And then there was a prison uprising at Rikers Island that no one could shut down. The 30 were all in a private signal group, and there was a lot of chatter about when and if they should grab their bags. Thing was, no one could go to Fort Doom until, and unless, Martin was there. The fort had serious defenses, and only he knew how to disable them, and he wasn't going to tell anyone how else to do it. Not until he was safely inside. He trusted the 30 enough to spend a long time in a lockdown with them, but he didn't want to tempt any of them with the power to lock him out and change up the guest list. Fort Doom was his. The house next to Martin's got burgled. Each of the houses on his road had their own gates and security, as well as the complex's overall security, manifested by rent-a-cops, mostly ex-military, zipping around in golf carts and watching giant banks of monitors fed by infrared CCTVs all around and outside the fence line. So naturally it was an inside job. Frank Patel had not been subtle about the liquidation of the majority of his assets to convertible, portable wealth in the form of precious metals and gemstones. He'd talk your ear off about it, the clever ways he'd found to hide the loot in hidden pouches and clothes for him and his family, and hidden panels in his car, and a hidden floor safe in his basement, behind the fire brick in the walk-in fireplace in his great room. Word got around, and 2 of the guards fritzed the cameras on his door, knocked at it like it was a routine call-out, and then bulled their way in, tied him and his kids up, and got all of it. More than $10 million in anonymous, convertible wealth. The guards disappeared off the face of the earth, and G4S, who supplied them, brought in heavy lawyers and insurance underwriters and PIs who started hinting heavily that Patel was in on the robbery. It was ugly. And it got worse when Patel blew his brains out. He was heavily leveraged and had just lost his life savings. To be honest, Martin was surprised he didn't take his wife and kids with him. It was the sight of them the next day, their faces blank masks as they drove into Patel's gate towards his house and garage, that spooked Martin so that he made the call, firing off a mass text to the 30 and then autopiloting through the routine to get his go bags and other gear, including the Rothschilds in their portable life support machines, into his armored Toyota Tacoma with its overcab cargo pod, camouflaged to look like a camping accessory, but actually as armored up as the Tacoma's body and windshields, with spare gas, tires, guns, ammo, food, even a chainsaw. He rehearsed this once a week using the interior door connecting the house to the garage. He also had a randomizer that ordered him to drive the Tacoma periodically, so it wouldn't be unusual to see him leaving with it. He generally made a point of stopping at a lumber yard on the way home and driving back with some 15-foot 2x4s or plastic pipes sticking out of the back of the overcab, just in case anyone was looking. So he hit the road at 5:30 the next morning, which was within the parameters for his normal work schedule. There were days when market-moving events were predicted for London or Frankfurt when he'd go in even earlier. No big deal. He had the house in lockdown, and he waved to the security guard on the gate as he cruised through. And then he slipped his gate and toll transponders into a Faraday pouch and stuck them into the glove compartment. At a deserted red light, he peeled off his top layer of business clothes to reveal well-worn, high-quality fishing gear. He ostentatiously placed a tackle box on his passenger seat so anyone who took a close look would see a middle-aged, fit guy heading out of town for a weekend of fly fishing. Not a multimillionaire with interesting quantities of easily convertible wealth, and the kind of vehicle that you could live out of for a week without resupply over rough terrain in the face of hostile belligerents. Thus camouflaged, he switched his phone into airplane mode and drove it 1 mile under the speed limit for the next 4 hours. Only 16 out of the 30 showed up in the first 48 hours. He took pains to disguise how furious that made him, because the 16 needed to see him as a cool-headed, forward-looking leader, not a child who was upset that half the guests hadn't come to his birthday party. The no-shows included 4 singles, all women, including the hottest 2 roommates who were definitely not lesbians based on their dating history, though he'd sometimes pondered the possibility that they weren't exclusively hetero. He had only the king-size bed in Fort 2. The 16 trickled in, maintaining radio silence the whole way. He had a satellite internet link at the fort, and he personally vetted every device for location data leakage before he let it connect to the Wi-Fi downlink from the disguised dish. He greeted the new arrivals with ice-cold, perfect Manhattans that he pre-mixed and sealed in plastic sous vide pouches, complete with cherries. As they cycled through the airlock into the fort, he'd pull a pouch out of the freezer, snip it open, and pour it over ice, adding a twist of lemon rind and putting on a little antique silver serving tray he picked up on a trip to Versailles. He relished those moments when someone tense and tired stepped into Fort Doom's hospitality suite, the first room past the airlock, with its thick Persian rugs and soothing watercolors, seeing him, the leader, in his comfortable, broken-in tactical pants and shirt, smiling his wide smile, eyes twinkling, offering a cocktail. The semiotics of it were, "Welcome to the apocalypse. This is going to be fun." The hospitality suite was as grand as it was, in part to offset the inevitable disappointment in the Spartan staterooms. Singles and doubles, with shared chem toilets and a communal shower at the end of a hall. There was plenty of fresh water in the fort, assuming they were able to resupply within the first month, but until things shook out, most showering would be accomplished via the fort's ample supply of unscented baby wipes. There were other communal areas, a game room, a dining room, a kitchen, a panic room hidden beneath the garage. He drew up a rota, cooking, cleaning, inventorying, anything to keep everyone busy. He proposed, that is, mandated, a daily hour of news consumption in the hospitality suite when they'd all tune in at once, crowdsourcing a scour through all their channels and recommendations, finding the noteworthy stories that seemed to encapsulate and summarize the chaos outside, and then discussing them in a round-robin circle, with Martin moderating. It was hard to tell whether things were deteriorating or whether it was just the usual baseline of craziness, made more vivid by the fact that they'd all hunkered down in a fortress to await the collapse of civilization. Getting worse or not, stuff was happening hard outside in the world. A bombing in New York, riots in a suburb of Atlanta, a conspiracy theory about the oil pipeline fire in Canada that blamed the fires on a cover-up. Though what the cover-up was, no one could understand. Everyone joked that it was a cover-up of pedophiles because the theories were always about covering up for pedophiles. A refugee ship had arrived in Miami, a flotilla from a dozen drowning Caribbean islands. Sailboats and scows and dinghies lashed together and coming ashore on a trash-strewn beach, rushing the CBP lines in the teeth of rubber bullets and drifting clouds of gas. But Phoenix, not so much. Calm. The mayor and the governor attended a reception together for the library system and then led the attendees on an evening constitutional to celebrate the end of the heat wave. And by the time they'd gotten 3 blocks, word had got out and thousands of people had joined them. Traffic jammed as people read about it on social and got in their cars and streamed in. And when the traffic got too bad, people just pulled off the road and threw block parties, buying out grocery stores and handing around beers and snacks, no fights. The hashtag filled up with great pictures, bands playing on front lawns while kids danced in the streetlight glow. The next day, the 16 became 14 when one of the couples went home. Privately, Martin was enraged, but he didn't want to show it. He made a performance of giving them soulful hugs and long hand clasps and assuring them they could come back if and when it was time. He wondered how long before the 14 became the 10, the 9, the 8, until it was just Martin waiting for the apocalypse in his private fortress. It wasn't long. Despite his official 1 hour of news-a-day policy, he, of course, had a bunch of bots that checked the headlines for him and messaged him when certain keywords started to cluster. The Phoenix Street Party pumped a lot of good vibes into the city, but it wasn't enough. A live-streamed traffic stop ended with a Phoenix cop spooking at what he said was a gun, it may have been a phone, and shooting into a car. The family in it were as respectable as you could ask for, literally on their way home from church on Sunday. And the little boy who died in his mother's arms was wearing a tiny suit and bow tie and white shirt that showed the blood. The streets erupted. Protests, counter-protests with white nationalists carrying sticks and flagpoles, fights, riots, arson. Martin noticed one of the single girls quietly unpacking a suitcase he'd earlier noticed her quietly packing. The 14 alternated between looking smug and looking worried. He got notice that 7 more were on their way out to the fort, and then one of the 2 really hot single women emailed him to ask if she could bring her equally hot co-worker. Martin looked up the co-worker on Facebook and made an exception to his policy and told her to go ahead. He instantly regretted it. It wasn't good leadership, but what was done, and hell, maybe it would blow over. The first crisis came 2 weeks later. The internet had been coming in and out and had finally gone down the day before. There were 8 ground stations that the satellite he subscribed to could use, and 6 of them had been sporadic. But then they went dark. And then the other 2, in mountain strongholds far from the madding crowds, had disappeared. He put the perimeter on full alert and buttoned down the fort. The fort had high ground over it, and cameras on the peak watched every road for the approach of anything bigger than a jackrabbit, and put it up on screens all over the fort. And they'd had plenty of false alarms. They made jokes about how much unexpected big game there was in this part of Arizona, and asked how many steers would fit in the freezers. They pointedly didn't discuss why steers were wandering around untethered and unaccompanied by ranchers. But then there was a Jeep, driving straight for Fort Doom, in a beeline that made it clear the driver knew where he was going. A few of the 30 had trickled in after they'd gone on high alert, but this wasn't any of the vehicles he'd collected profiles on. Grimly, he unlocked one of the guns. Of the 22 in the fort, 8 were really good with rifles and 4 were merely competent. The fort had sniper points with firing slits, and a foreign currency specialist and a mergers and acquisitions lawyer climbed the ladders up to them with guns strapped to their backs. The vestibule was a killing zone. Once you were inside it, you were dead, assuming Martin wanted you dead. Even full body armor wouldn't protect you from a modified AR-15 on full auto firing into the room. Even if you hit the deck, the firing slit was well designed. The Jeep pulled up in the designated waiting zone and 5 people got out. One of them waved toward the front door. Martin zoomed in the feed and swore it was Albert, who he knew from the gym. They'd gotten to be buddies outside the gym, went hunting together once, and Martin had been impressed by what a great shot Albert was. He was 10 years younger than Martin, too, and ran a marathon every year. Martin thought about how useful it would be to have someone who could chop wood for 8 hours straight and then blow out a deer's brain from 200 yards. And then he'd invited Albert to join the 30, making a little ceremony out of it at a nice whiskey bar they both liked. In a back booth, they toasted each other at the end of the night, and Martin let Albert pick up the tab. Albert had brought friends. He waved again and then made a sweeping gesture to take in his friends. 3 dudes all about his age, all Hispanic like Albert. 1 girl, no, a woman in her 40s, and shrugged broadly and apologetically. He gestured at the others to stay and then jogged up to the vestibule, stepping into the killing zone. "Martin, you there?" he said into the mic grill. "What's going on, Albert?" Martin kept his voice cold and businesslike. Everyone else in the fort was watching them. "You made it," he smiled into the camera. "Thank God. Can you let me in?" "Albert, you know the rules." Albert's smile faltered. He dropped his voice. "I'm sorry, man. My cousins and my aunt, my uncle." He dropped more. He got shot. It was just in the arm, but he went to the hospital and never came back. There's a militia controlling it now. I couldn't leave my aunts and cousins. She's an amazing cook, and the boys will work like mules, strong, you know? "You know the rules." Martin wondered if he had it in him to murder Albert, his cousins, his aunt. What if they went away and came back with friends? The fort could withstand most small arms, but a siege could outlast their water and food. He swallowed and quietly cursed Albert. What an asshole. What a fucking idiot. He was going to turn Martin into a murderer. Albert was wheedling now. Come on, don't be like that. I'll pay you back for whatever they eat, and that just as soon as it's all over, with interest. Come on, Martin. Martin pressed the intercom button combo that played a bowel-loosening, gun-cocking sound with lots of extra bass. Go, Albert. Go and don't come back. Albert jumped at the sound of the gun cocking, took an involuntary step. I can't believe you, Martin. Jesus fucking Christ. Do the people you've got locked up in there know what they've gotten themselves in for? He very nearly shot Albert right then. Martin could withstand many things, but challenges to his leadership were an existential risk to the whole Fort Doom project. An internal rebellion could leave them all dead, or weakened to the point where they'd be easy pickings once the marauders started coming out. He did not pull the trigger, but he did detonate one of his precious roadside charges, blowing out a chunk of the trail leading up to the fort. He chose a lower one to keep the anti-personnel shrapnel from hitting any of Albert's asshole relatives, but he wanted them to leave, not linger and die on his doorstep. What a fucking mess. Albert stared into the camera for a wild moment, then reached around to the small of his back, right where you keep a pistol, and Martin nearly blew him away, but then Albert put his hands back in front of him. Fuck you, Martin. Jesus Christ, you psychopath, you asshole. I can't believe this shit. I hope the people you got in there know they've locked themselves in with a psycho. He leaned into the grill to shout the last few words, making them distort in the speakers on the other side. Martin winced. I'm going, Martin. You have a real good life. He trudged back to his car and held a short conference with his relations, replete with violent hand gestures. They all piled back into the Jeep, and then Albert got in, giving Martin a long look at his middle finger before gunning it and driving away. That night, Martin recriminated it with himself for long hours, struggling to fall asleep. He had recurring visions of Albert showing up in the days or weeks to come, still furious, heavily armed, with friends, or cousins. Albert came from one of those big Catholic Hispanic families. He'd have lots of cousins. Martin's buried roadside bombs included a pretty big one right at the trailhead. He could have taken them all out at the press of a button. He finally drifted off after midnight, still uncertain whether he'd doomed them all. As it turned out, he never saw Albert again, but he did see the aunt. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to stop. I don't know how often I'll sit and do this, but I find it relaxing to read at night, and maybe you find it relaxing to listen to other people read. If you tuned in late, this is Cory Doctorow's collected short stories, Radicalized. I'm reading the one called The Masque of the Red Death. I mean, if you're listening, you can really hear his anger and frustration with elitist douchebags who are looking to skip out on society because they feel like they're deserved of it or something. I don't know. But it's based on an Edgar Allan Poe story by the same name, Masque of the Red Death. If you like podcasts, Mallory O'Mara and Bria Grant run a podcast called Reading Glasses, and as part of a thing that they're doing, I guess similar to sharing stories with people in times of stress, they'll be reading as a group Masque of the Red Death, Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, and then getting together at the end of this month. If you go to at Reading G Podcast, I think is their Twitter handle for the podcast, or at Bria Grant or at Mallory O'Mara, you'll certainly find a link to it. I think it's the March the 28th, but they've got a group discussion set up. If that's your sort of thing, you might want to take a look at that. So yeah, this has been Cory Doctorow's Radicalized, with reading from the novella Masque of the Red Death. So until next time.